Okay, so moving on to our last topic for this section, let's talk about survey metrics. So we're going to talk a bit about designing surveys and possibly administration. We'll see. So in psychological research, or really any kind of research, sometimes you might want to directly observe a behavior, but other times that's not really feasible. And instead, you want to just ask people what their behavior is. You also might want to use a survey to assess their attitudes, their beliefs, their intentions, and, like we said, behavior. This is kind of common sense, but sometimes when you're dealing with something that isn't currently ongoing or happens outside the lab or throughout the day or throughout the years, even, obviously you can't really directly observe that, right? So it's kind of tough to say you're looking at some form of diet, just follow people around 24 hours a day to see what they eat, right? That's kind of impossible, probably not ethical either. But with a survey, you can actually just ask them, what have you been eating lately? What are your attitudes towards this? What do you believe about this? So on and so forth. Now, with all that said, if you're thinking critically, you might wonder, well, are people going to report the truth here, and are their assessments actually accurate? Well, not necessarily, and that's something we are of course concerned with. Using surveys and just in general with research, right? We want our measures, of course, to be valid. We're measuring what they actually should be measuring. So just as a neat little story related to this idea, I was talking to someone from nutrition science, and they were basically saying that nutrition. I don't know if this is true or not. I don't mean to. I'm not hating on nutrition science, but they're basically saying it's not actually a science because you can't at all trust what people report. So, in other words, people have almost no memory of what they ate throughout the day, and they don't really know. They're not really reporting what's actually going on. So different studies that report these great diets, um, they might be they might be kind of full of it because again, it's really hard to know how much of what people report is actually accurate. That was just one person's opinions. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is an interesting example of how surveys can be problematic, of course. Um, Another example, let's say you were to look at survey people on memory, right? Like what memory strategy, what study strategy is is best, leads gives you the best results for exams. Well, if you take my cognition lab um, later on, you'll learn all about how what people think is the best memory strategy is usually the opposite of what's actually the best memory strategy. So what they think is a good way to study is the opposite of what's actually a good way to study. So that's where it's kind of tough in some situations to use just some reflection or a survey to see what people think. So, anyways, that was a bit of a tangent, but it's just something that's important to think about. Kind of in general with research methodology, there's always going to be um, things you should consider, and there will be times when a survey is great, sometimes when a behavioral measure is great, other times when just observation is great, which we'll talk about later on, so on and so forth. But anyways, just think critically about that. Sure. So one thing about surveys, though, you want to be clear on is that surveys are not specific to one type of design. So we use surveys in descriptive research, correlational research, and experimental research. Okay. A survey is kind of just a platform for collecting data. It can still include an independent variable, or it can include a predictor variable, or it can include no additional variables. So descriptive surveys tend to be, just when you want to find out maybe people's opinion on something, you're not trying to You're not manipulating anything. You're not saying, does it connect to some other trait or personality or other factor or whatever. You're just looking for a description of, say, how many people drive drunk or whatever it might be. That would be descriptive research you could do through a survey. Of course, that might be an example where people lie, but anyways. You could, of course, do something correlational using a survey. So, for example, maybe you want to look at self-reported diet and perceived health to examine the relationship. So in that case, again, the data is still being collected through the survey, but we do actually have more than one variable, and we're looking, um, is there are two variables, and is there a relationship among them? And lastly, we can, of course, still run experiments using surveys. So say you were to randomly assign people to groups, like a control group and an Atkins diet, and then ask about perceived health. So you have a manipulation that's occurring outside the survey, um, but you're still collecting your data through a survey. And again, you can also have experiments that are embedded within the survey. So you might, say, be interested in how you word a question. Is that going to change people's attitudes towards some issue or some behavior? Okay. So again, we can run all these designs with or without using a survey. Survey is just a platform. So when you run a survey, there's, of course, keeping in mind with these things, things you might want to consider collecting. One would be the participants of the characteristics of the participant, so things like age, sex, ethnicity, so on. If you're running some sort of correlation, predictor variables. So does some factor correlate with other items in the survey? And some outcome variable, what you're interested in. But again, it all just depends on what your goal is, what you hope to learn from your survey. So, I mean, this goes for all research methods, but you of course want to define your topic clearly. You need to want to develop a clear operational definition of what you're trying to study. Remember, an operational definition is how you're going to measure something. So if I'm measuring anxiety, I want to think about, that's my operational definition. Anxiety would be a construct that I'm interested in studying. How I'm going to measure it is the operational definition. Okay. Now, as we're going to see, creating a survey is not always, it often can be pretty hard. So sometimes creating an unbiased survey where all the questions are good and it's reliable, as we're going to talk about, that's not always easy. So sometimes, actually, I'd say more often than not, if you can find another survey that already assesses what you want to look at, then there's no reason not to use it. So when reading the literature, if you find that, just like how you can use other literature to inspire methods for researching a question, you can find other surveys that you can use. So, for example, again, if I was looking at anxiety levels, well, there's several different anxiety surveys out there that people have used, that people have evaluated, and I wouldn't say perfected, but um, certainly gotten to a pretty solid level. So rather than reinvent the wheel or try to come up with something new that's maybe not gonna work, it might be better to just use other surveys from existing literature. Now, with that said, there might be situations where you do need to make your own survey. And if that's the case, um, one thing you'll typically do is pilot your survey. Okay. So if you remember, piloting is just kind of a trial run of your study. So in the case of a survey, it would be testing it out to see how it goes, see if there are any problems with it before running the full amount of people that you actually plan to run. You might just, you're going to run 100 people, start with 10, just see are there any issues you need to figure out or address with your survey, and then if there aren't, then go ahead, and if there are, obviously address them. And when you're piloting your survey, there's of course things you want to keep in mind. A big one that's, it seems straightforward, but you never know, is make sure the questions are clear and understandable to your population. And then also possibly choose from a pool of potential questions. Right? And we're going to kind of see how these two things, how we look at, how we examine these things, as well as um, how to improve them. Okay, so with the first one, you of course want to use simple rather than complex words. We want to make sure we're not um, bombarding people with terms they don't understand, or even worse, that they misunderstand. Right? So let's look at some examples here. Um, we don't, and kind of building up this issue, we don't want to use jargon. So if we were to say the product helped me meet my OKRs, if you're doing some sort of customer satisfaction survey, well, I don't know what OKRs are, so I mean that could go wrong for several different reasons. One possibility is that they do have an opinion on um, what's actually their goals, and they could give you a good answer there, but now they can't because of the jargon. Another possibility is maybe they misunderstand it. They think OKRs is not what you actually, what it actually is, and they give you kind of a wrong answer, so to speak. So obviously we want to keep with simple simple phrasing and not overcomplicate things, and make sure that people can understand what you're asking. So in other words, just make questions short and easy to understand. Another example, service customer service question with jargon. How was your FaceTime with your customer support rep? I mean, that's not too bad, but I don't know, like FaceTime, maybe they're thinking, is it exclusive to seeing them face to face? Are they thinking of the app? Who knows exactly? Um, Customer support rep, like they might wonder, who was was I even talking to a support rep, or was it some other position? So anyways, you just want to keep it as simple as possible. You might say, how would you rate your experience with this team member? Okay. Um, it's also very important when designing a survey. And let me just take a step back here too. So kind of getting into what all the various things that can go wrong with a survey are. So these are kind of these are bad questions to ask, because they can give you misleading data, obviously. So this is kind of where we say designing a survey is not easy. It can go wrong, and it can often be improved. And that's where, if you can find an existing one that's been validated, then it's best to just go with that. So another example is that we need to be very precise when giving our survey. Um, so when you ask people kind of a vague question that is really not defined, that obviously makes it difficult for them to answer. So if you just ask them something like, "Do you approve of gun control?" or "Do you like this policy?" or "Do you like this politician?" Well, it's kind of really unclear, because I mean, be specific, right? Like which specific bill or form of control are you talking about? Which politician, or even what aspects of the politician? So just to give you another example, if you ask people, "Do you like this person?" Well, I mean, maybe they like parts of that person, but they don't like other parts. Maybe they like some of the policies, but not others. That's certainly possible. So these kind of blanket, very non-specific questions, of course, give you very unclear data that's hard to interpret. Right? So that's always something to keep in mind. Just make sure you're being very precise, and being clear about what you're asking about. Another thing, another big issue with surveys is that um, you don't want to ask leading questions. So what we mean by that is we don't want to ask questions that are going to really kind of push people towards a certain answer. For example, you're to ask, how great is our hardworking customer service team? Well, asking how great to be, well, let's go through this word by word. So how great, I mean, that's not really a neutral question. You're better off to say, how would you describe? Because how great is, of course, implying that they're either super great or moderately great or slightly great. There's no real bad end of the scale, so to speak. Saying our hardworking customer service, well, I mean, again, you're just implying that they're hardworking, and maybe they are, but we're not trying to bias people, or we shouldn't be. So saying that they're hardworking is pretty biasing. Um, how awesome is the product? That's obvious. So this is a fixed version, of course. How would you describe your experience with the customer service team? So this is totally neutral. It's not pushing you to say that they're good or they're bad. Um, how awesome is this product? That's obviously pushing people towards the product being good, same problem. Better to ask, how would you rate this product? Kind of the flip side of that would be, what problems do you have with the design team? So that's again implying or assuming that they have problems with the design team, which might not be the case. Okay. Again, an alternative would be to ask, how likely are you to recommend working with the design team? We're not going to go into sensitive questions, actually. And that's not on the exam, so you don't have to worry about that. We also want to avoid assumptions. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the next one we'll talk about, but sometimes you ask a question and it's kind of predicated on one thing already being true. So, for example, asking, where do you like drinking beer? That's really kind of a dumb question, because how do you know that the person likes drinking beer? Um, you're just assuming that they like drinking beer, and the question is, where do they like drinking? That's not really a good question. The only exception would be if you had somehow already established, say you're interviewing people, or rather surveying people that you happen to know already drink beer. This might be okay, but it's if you're surveying someone who you don't know if they like beer or not, then this question is obviously bad. Okay. All right, next one, and this is a common one, something known as a barreled question. Please indicate the degree of agreement or disagreement with this statement. My physical health is good because I exercise regularly. Well, think about that. Why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because it's asking two questions at the same time. So, I mean, and just to clarify, that's a little bit different from making an assumption. Here, you're not asking two questions, but you're asking a question assuming something necessary to answer that question is already true. This is different. This is where you're asking basically two things at the same time. So my physical health is good. That's one question. And then because I exercise regularly, well, that's kind of a different question, right? It'd be very difficult to know how someone is going to respond to this. So my physical health is good because I exercise regularly. Well, what if their physical health is good, but not because they exercise regularly, but because of some other reason? That's that's not really clear, and you can't really parse out those two things from this question. So asking two things at the same time is obviously bad, because it's really unclear, what's going on there. Or again, the other way might be, maybe they exercise regularly, but that doesn't impact their physical health, or at least they don't think it does. Well, again, we don't know how they would answer that, because they might say strongly agree, because yes, they exercise regularly, but how is this being factored in? It's not really clear. So this is not a good question. So again, we want to avoid asking more than one thing at the same time. Okay. So the next thing we'll talk about, so those are all kind of the question issues that can come up that you need to be aware of. But the other thing to consider when designing a survey, and this could also apply to really any metric that you're going to use, any dependent variable, is going to be how you structure your scales. So you could ask people, you could ask, well, this one's bad because this is again double barreled. How would you describe your health and nutrition? Well, health and nutrition are not, I mean, they're related, I'm sure, but not identical, so that's pretty unclear. But the other thing to consider here is how we're going to actually quantify this. So when it comes to actually recording responses, there's three things you can use. One is an open-ended question, one is restricted, and one is partially open-ended. So open-ended is exactly what it sounds like. People answer the question in their own words. So you give them like a text box that they can type their answer into or write their answer into, or something along those lines. Restricted is just like it sounds as well. This is when they have to choose, so it's basically multiple choice. They have to choose from a list of alternatives. Okay. So that would be this one here. How good is your health? And they have to pick one of these. This would be, say, open-ended, where they have to just answer in their own words. The last option that's a hybrid between these two is partially open-ended, and we're going to look at the pros and cons of each of these in a second. But partially open-ended means that they have one option, like an other response. So that would be if you added down here other, and if they click other or select other, they can type in their response. Right. So yeah, this is pretty straightforward. This is what restricted looks like. Again, just picking one option. This would be open-ended, so you just give them a question. They have to, again, answer it in their own words. And then the middle ground would be partially open-ended, meaning they can pick an option, but they can also pick other and then explain their answer. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons of each of these methods. The nice thing about restricted answers is that it's really easy to analyze. Okay, so as you can probably imagine, when you have something like this, it's really just as simple as, okay, how many, I mean, you can do this with Excel or most survey platforms. Just figure out how many people answered this, how many people answered this, how many people answered this. Okay. So really easy to analyze. Open-ended, on the other hand, has to be coded. So that could be kind of a whole other topic about how you code open-ended answers, qualitative research design. So we won't go into that too much, but yeah, the basic problem is, or maybe not problem, but at least downside of using open-ended is that it has to be coded in some way. So people have to go in there, read the answers, and you have to decide on some sort of criteria, like say every time they mention this word or every time they mention this phrase, um, or it relates in some way to this, we're going to count it as this kind of responses. So you end up kind of transforming it into, usually you'll transform it into some sort of actual quantitative data, which is a lot of work. But on the other hand, if you do go with a restricted format, the cons are that you're going to get less information overall, and you may be putting words in their mouth. Um, so, for example, going with this one, I mean, describing your physical health considered compared to the average person. Well, I mean, that's not a simple question. Well, actually, let's use this one for now. How would you describe your physical health? Well, I mean, that depends, right? That's kind of a complicated question. If I were just me personally answer this, I'm not exactly be sure what to indicate because I mean, on one hand, like I compete in powerlifting, so I guess I'm sort of physically fit, but I mean, I'm not the definitely not a great runner. I don't have the highest of endurances. Um, and I do get some neck pain, so I don't know where would I rank myself. It's kind of hard to make a decision there. It's not really a straightforward answer for me. So that would be an example of where it can be hard to just use a closed format because you might be oversimplifying things, and again, you also might be putting words in their mouth, implying something, or kind of leading them with a question, like we talked about. In contrast, an open-ended question is, of course, going to have more information, more rich, and more of a reflection of your thoughts. So, just again with that previous example, I could actually explain to you if it was open-ended. Well, I'm healthy in this aspect, but maybe not so much in this aspect. One other thing that you have to account for if you use open-ended questions is that um, you have to account for fluency and also the amount of content. So when you provide um, an open-ended question, some people will write or type a lot more than others, and some people might also be more fluent in what you're asking and have more to say about it. So that can, of course, um, influence what you find, right? And I mean, it just kind of adds another layer of complexity to how you're going to code it because someone might, mention the same word twice that you're coding off of, but that could also be because they wrote a much longer answer. So that's another thing that needs to be taken into account is how much are they going to say? Okay. Um, Partially open-ended again is the middle ground, which which can be nice. Oh, and just one more thing to add to this. Because data is so much easier to analyze when it's restricted, you can run a lot more people. Whereas with an open-ended, because you have to code all of it, you can't run as many people. So, I could if I had like a quick survey, I could run it online and collect data from thousands of people, easily analyze my data, get a nice big sample, and also get a nice representative sample. But on the other hand, with open-ended questions, I'm not going to collect that much data because, again, it takes so long to code. So the middle ground is again partially open-ended. This is again when you can respond with other and then explain your answer. Or if so, why? That'd be another example. So you might ask people something like, "Do you agree with this policy? If so, why? Or if not, why?" You can get some more information that way. Um, and again, the pro here, just like with fully open-ended, is that the participant can list an answer that the researcher didn't provide. But again, then it still falls into the same cons of open-ended where it complicates data analysis. And it's not always clear how you're going to deal with those answers, like those other answers. I mean, if you end up with the majority of your participants giving an other response, then you almost might as well just be doing open-ended, right? Because most people are select other. But other times you might get only a few people responding other, and then it kind of becomes hard to filter to account for their answers because there aren't that many examples to deal with. So again, it can get tricky. Take a quick break there.